All right. Do you want to hit us with the first question?
The question goes as follows. Hi. First off, I love your podcast. It really is amazing, and I learned a lot from it, especially coming from a background where architecture is widely known or spoken about. I'm a landscape architecture student, and I have been facing a sort of dilemma and wanted to ask how you guys would go about it. I'm a third year at X school, and we just learned the softwares last year, but I feel like everyone around me is a pro at it already. I'm a slow learner and like to experiment because I don't have a really clear idea on how to get to the finished product yet, so I test things out to see what would look best or just generally learning as I go. And with that comes a lot of trial and error, which again takes time. Sadly, we have never enough time, so I either never make the deadline or I produce work that meets the standard but I'm not happy with. It leaves me feeling discouraged, but I really love the discipline and I don't know what to do. Sometimes it feels more like a factory line than a space of creativity and exploration. The time constraint also makes me really anxious every time.
Well, first of all, thanks for writing in and for the kind words. I think there's a lot of actually smaller questions within the paragraph that they submitted. The first thing that they state is that they feel like everyone around them is a pro already when they are not.
But the funny thing is that everyone around them probably feels the same way he or she does.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just, they're just not showing it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's... it's, one of the benefits of the show for us, and I think also for our listeners, is that through listening to the show and through us talking with many guests, we realize we're not alone in whatever we're feeling. And even though we've been practicing for a number of years and have experiences and whatnot, I think architecture and landscape architecture in this sense, I'll probably use the word architecture in this recording, but I mean both professions. It requires so much attention and focus, and it's a very personal process when you're designing or when you have your own office or with whatever thing, that because of that focus, it's very easy to feel isolated because that focus is central, right? It's a one vision, one lane kind of feeling, and you forget that there's others out there who are probably going through the same exact thing. And this certainly applies to us in a professional setting. It also applies to students in a studio. It's very easy for students, even in a studio space, to at times feel like they are all alone. No one understands them. Others are advancing ahead of them. And it's easy to feel isolated, even though physically, again, you're sharing space with people. And I think it's important to remember generally that whatever you are going through and feeling, there's at least probably another 3 people in that same studio are feeling the same way. And probably everyone in the studio has felt that way at some point, or they have that emotion, but maybe it's more in the background and less at the surface. So I think that's the first thing. And like, there's also the fine line and the balance of being aware of others and thinking about others and understanding where they are relative to you, but also not really caring about them.
Yeah, I think also that, like it's the feeling of not knowing something or like not being the expert at it is a feeling that you're going to have your whole career, right? Like even if you master designing, office buildings, well, one day maybe you get another type of project and you've never done it and you feel like, a lot of offices know how to do them and you don't. And now what? It's a constant feeling that architects will feel forever, pretty much.
Yeah.
Unless you've done everything and you've lived 100 years, it will be there. So it's totally normal and you kind of have to get used to it in some ways. I think it also goes back to the feeling of imposter syndrome too,
Sure.
where you're kind of like thinking everyone around you knows what to do and you're there and you don't, therefore you don't belong there, or maybe you're behind. But I think it also means that you need time, to get to the level where you need to be.
Yeah, I think you touched on an interesting point, which we might talk about more in another recording, which is part of the nature of what we all do is just to be lost and to be, I guess you could say, brave enough to tackle new things. That's like by definition what design is.
Yeah.
Especially the easy example when it comes to practicing when you're trying to do a different project you've never done before. Any architect who's of value, or landscape architect, when they are approached to do a new project, they don't shy away from it. They go head on straight into it, and they don't care that they've never done it before. Of course, for the clients, it's a different emotion, but that's a marker of I think what it means to be someone in these professions. And when it comes to skill sets, it's, I've never really thought about it as the two being the same thing, but it is kind of the same thing, right? It's knowledge, right? It's knowledge you don't have regarding a X project type like I was referring to. It's knowledge of not knowing how to use this tool, but you have to trust yourself that you will figure it out.
And I
would also, go ahead.
And I think also when you worry too much about the final outcome, that also blocks you from figuring out that new tool, that new knowledge, that new skill set.
And it is more challenging when you're a student, though, because you are by yourself. In the professional setting, when you don't know something, you can't. In some ways, it's much easier to have the attitude of it'll be figured out. We will figure it out, because oftentimes you're not alone. You're in an office with people, so it's essentially kind of a group. What do you call it? Hive mind that you're part of, and then there's your community, your professional community outside of the office, and then there's all the consultants and other professionals that are on the projects, and like it will get figured out. Like we will figure it out somehow, because we have to, as all of us collectively, as a series of a collection of professions, like we have to. I don't know, and now I'm thinking more about technical things, right? It might be me, it might be someone else in my office, it might be I speak with a colleague, it might be the contractor who's like, yeah, I think we should do it this way, or the engineer, or all of us, or it might be the client. But like we'll get there.
But I feel like that collective spirit could happen within this class, whatever class that is, right? Like if some students have, like quicker capabilities in learning and using the software, like they should be helping each other out, right? It's not like you're competing for the same job here. Like you're all trying to get to a point and graduate and learn the stuff. So it's not like there is only like 4 A's that could be given in a class, right? Like everybody could get A's. So it's kind of like where school is a bit weird, because sometimes it comes naturally, like students have affinity and they like start to help out each other. Or you have a friend that's really good at something and they're going to show you. But I feel like the class culture in school should also emphasize on that, like the collective spirit of helping each other out a bit more.
Yeah, and I think it's up to the teacher to help cultivate that. I didn't really have that mentality in school, and that was one of the things I probably would have changed, is my own personal outlook in terms of being open or willing to ask other people how they did stuff. And in my case, I don't think it had to do with a fear of people realizing I don't know something. I think it was more to do that I just didn't trust anybody. And I'm thinking maybe more about design things and not kind of technical proficiencies. It's just, I think also part of what happens in design school is it is a very kind of emotional and personal and sensitive time. And you're trying to figure out exactly what works for you and how all of this works anyway.
Yeah, I know, yeah.
And it's almost like and that's why I think teaching also is, sometimes I feel it's very easy, but it's also really not easy, because you have to be very careful with how you intervene and speak with students, and the touch points you have with them and how you say things and whatnot. Because it really can set a person down a wrong path for a project, or also just confuse them or make them feel depressed or motivate them or whatever else it would be. And I think for me, at least when I was a student, because I was very aware of like when you're in design school, for technical things and even not technical things, you feel like there's 100 different ways to do it, and you just don't know what is the right way. And you can ask for advice, but I always found that when I asked for advice, I didn't like the advice I got. I'm like, that doesn't doesn't feel right.
Oh, really?
And so I didn't trust anybody, which was maybe not the right kind of conclusion to come to based on the feedback, based on me not liking the feedback. But that also didn't allow me to probably ask for help as often. So anyway, to your point, I think just asking colleagues for help would be the best thing to do. And I've been part of studios as a teacher where the class didn't quite click with each other, and I've been have had studios where the students really congealed, and it's amazing how much more learning happens and how much happier everyone is and how much more creative they are. Like everything, all like the levels across the board, like again, happiness, mental health, camaraderie, skill level, technical skill level and design, interest, curiosity, and like everything just boosts, it gets like doubled automatically when you have a class that is, and I'm not saying they all have to be best friends, but they're just friendly toward each other and they feel like they're part of a group. Now we can achieve this thing together, even if it's not a group project. So, again, I think it falls on the teacher, but I as individuals, as students in a class, like you should not be afraid to like start that. And it's a weird thing too, in a studio of 15 or 20 or whatever the number is. It's kind of like lighting a little bit of a fire or kindling. Like if it starts right, it can kind of catch on, and then everyone starts to get into that mode. Because I guarantee you the sensation of being isolated on an island is shared amongst everyone. Maybe not in the same way for you. Like for this person, it's more of a technical proficiency or lack thereof. But for everyone else, there's something across the 12 different skills a landscape architect has to have that someone is feeling that they are not good at. And I think just talking about it it's fine. It's a perfectly fine thing. I also find that is one of the challenges with students is, unlike myself, who I just didn't trust people, I think other students are afraid because they don't want to seem stupid or sound stupid.
I think that's also like if let's say if you're the only one in this class who's struggling, it's a bit hard to admit that, hey, I'm kind of struggling learning this software. Or if you're the only one who's always asking for help, maybe you're the only one who's always asking for help in this class, but maybe you can provide help in another class where you're actually doing much better than other people. Right? I think it's about finding your balance. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, maybe if I was a student in this position, the thing you could do if the culture of the class or the teacher is not like pushing, students to interact or help each other, and if the people in the class are reasonable people that you could be friendly with, I would probably raise my hand at some point or go to the teacher and be like, look, I'm having some struggle here. Like, is there a way that maybe like, I don't know, someone could give me a quick tutorial, or is there any tips that anybody could give me just to kind of like unstuck myself from this situation?
I think it depends on your comfort level. You could ask directly your colleagues, but let's say you're a bit more I'm just making stuff up. I don't know this person, but let's say we can all imagine being in a studio and all the different types of people in the studio, and there's always one person who's like very introverted. They don't talk a whole lot. They're kind of socially awkward, whatever. Again, not projecting to this person. Just I'm saying there is that kind of individual. If you are that kind of individual, you still have a route because the teacher is the safe space. You just go to the teacher directly. You email them and say, can we talk? Or you do it via email and you say, like, I'm struggling and I think it'd be really beneficial for myself and other students in the class if we had if we dedicated some time in studio next week and we had one of the students who's really good at technical stuff with whatever programs, like just give a tutorial on how they do stuff. And that's like a win-win for everybody. The teacher is going to love you for that. I mean, as a teacher, my favorite students are the ones who were proactive, because it makes my job easier. It demystifies the teacher. On the teacher's side, we're always wondering like, what the fuck is going on with the students? Where are they mentally? Yeah, they seem to be in a good spot on Wednesday, and we have a very clear direction of what they're going to do the next week, but we've so many times we meet them like a week later and like, what the hell, you blew everything up now to So the teachers are always looking to create connections with their students if they care. And that's hard to do. So if you're a student and you talk to your teacher, dude, like they will love you. I'm not saying that because they're going to give you an A because of it, but it's good vibes. And it's a win for you because then you get education. It's a win for the other students because they probably have questions too. It's a win for the student who knows the most because now they feel like they have some value to contribute. And that's the best feeling any of us can ever have, is to be able to help someone else. And also for them to have to teach what they know actually improves what they know, because it's hard to teach. Like being able to teach something means another level of expertise that's way beyond knowing it for yourself. So actually thinking about it, like more of this stuff should have happened in studios. And from what I've seen, universities, certainly the universities I went to, and I think universities in general, the computer classes they have are a lot of times not quite like getting to the meat of it because they're taught by teachers who don't know what it means to be a student and don't know what it means to
who forgot what it means to start on something you absolutely you've never even heard of.
That, and I think it's just different. It's just different.
And you know, most classes, they have kind of like their recipe card on how to teach this class. You know, every year it's the same class, same number of students, and it's kind of like they just put out the card and teach the class, right? And I think also for them, it's more interesting if, like you said, like each group of students is different, or they have different demand, or they have different, you know, questions or lack of skills or things that they need. Also, I mean, you know, you're paying for school.
Yeah.
So let's get as much help and answers to your question to improve yourself as you can.
Yeah.
Like, you know, I don't think there is any shame in saying, like, I don't understand something. I'm not good at it. Is there any way I can get better? Like, do you have any tips? Because now it's the time, you know, school is the time for that.
I you know, looking back, I would have done more of these things in my own studios. You know, it felt like these types of what do you call it? Tutorial sessions took place, but they were like once, you know, every blue moon, and it was like someone made an initiative, good on them, and then there was coordination between teachers. It became like a multi-studio thing. It was like a lot of like kind of not red tape, but a lot of organizational crap that got in the way. And I would be much more frequent and informal about it if I could go back in time and be like, okay, like I'm gonna arbitrarily say that this Wednesday of whatever month we're gonna have a 1 hour tutorial session. Who in the class feels like they're pretty good at X program? Okay, you're gonna present like how you work and just talk through some tips for half an hour. Even if the session is informal again, and that student is not an expert at teaching and they fumble, it doesn't matter. It's actually a good lesson for that student to go through too, to have to explain things, and good for the class. And then it can be also, you know, general working studio time. So it's like whoever wants to come can come, and if you don't need to come, then you don't come. And I would you know, honestly think about it, I would have done that like reoccur like once a month, or studios now or not, depending on quarter semesters, like once a month or once every 3 weeks or something. Like we just have this hour thing, we book a room, whoever wants to come from this studio, others can come, and just have them happen all the time and do multiple versions of it. You know, if it's like Rhinoceros or Sketchup or whatever, like do that 3 times in a quarter. There's no need. That's what I'm saying too. It was always like this formal, like, okay, we're going to do it. Let's have a flyer and this is the date. It's like, but why? Why not just have this? Why not have sort of an in-between thing where it's not at someone's desk and it's not like a big formal thing, but somewhere between the two where we just do it reoccurring. And honestly, thinking about it now, it's sort of like you could do that with almost any topic, and it actually happens in the professional setting, where in 2 instances, one, in an office, there will be like once every 2 Fridays, there's some kind of office gathering thing, presentation of a project, presentation of a technology, presentation of someone's vacation, whatever it is, right? And that exists in offices to try and create a sense of social community, but also connection to everyone else's work, because in offices you have different studios and groups, and it's really hard for people to know what's going on because you're enveloped in your own team. Same thing in an academic space. It also happens in the professional setting between offices. So there are a lot of times locally groups of groups or communities of, let's say, architecture offices, and they'll get together once every quarter or once ever and just talk about a subject that's been chosen, because you need structure to the conversation. And you hang out, you eat pizza, and you just discuss, you know, I don't know what, hiring people or sustainability or like whatever it is. And that's a more formal thing because everyone's super busy in that kind of setting. But I think doing that can be very, very productive.
It's funny, like I took, you know, like computer software classes in school. Some of them were mandatory, some of them were not mandatory. And most of them were super boring, soporific. not interesting. 15 minutes after you start, you're already lost because the teacher is like 10 steps ahead the tutorial, and like you're still trying to like find where that tool he just clicked on is. and you look around and a lot of people are as lost, like we're just each hiding behind the monitors. And those classes are not, they're not really interesting. And honestly, a good YouTube tutorial about how to learn the software might be more efficient than most of these classes. But it's interesting. I was always very interested in those computer classes because it's fascinating, like what can you do with technology and all of that stuff. But it is hard, and there is a certain pace to them. And if you lose track, like it's easy to just like, I've missed the bus, like the class just keeps going on and you've just, you can't keep going.
Yeah.
And that's very frustrating because you're still sitting there and you can't follow along. So I don't know why they teach computer classes this way. Like I remember learning 3ds Max.
Yeah.
And it was awful.
Yeah.
It was awful. First of all, because the interface sucks. And also because like it was just, we were getting too much in the nitty-gritty of the software before even understanding like what should we be opening that software for, and kind of like putting things in perspective. And I think that's also the danger sometimes where teachers are too expert at what they do, is that, like you said, like they kind of forget the audience, like their audience, and where is the audience starting at, and what is the value of what they're teaching for that specific audience.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, so the first point I think is to ask for help if it's not being offered, and be proactive about that. It's one of the biggest superpowers you can have, I think, for anybody, and not just architects and landscape architects, is just asking for help. I feel like I read this about Steve Jobs, and I could be totally mistaken. I feel like I read this in something about him, that was one of his secret hacks. I mean, not really secret, not really hack, but he would just ask for help all the time. And it's interesting if you think about that for him, because everyone puts Steve Jobs on this pedestal as this kind of guru person and whatever else, right? But the idea that in his early days, and probably even before he passed away, he was asking people for help is fascinating. Like we generally don't think of individuals like him as people who would ask others for help, but it's necessary. And even recently for us, we had in our office, we had a question we were trying to find an answer to. And, I guess at some point also in my existence as an architect, I realized, well, I can sit at my desk and try and solve this thing internally amongst the office, let's say, or I can email the architects I know and be like, hey, friend, got a quick question for you. How do you guys do this? And they reply, because I know them, and they're like, oh, that's a good question. I've thought about this so many times. I've never asked anybody because I've been afraid or I've been busy or whatever, but I've always thought about that too. This is how we do it. How do you do it? And I say, okay, I understand. This is how we do it in our office. By the way, I did ask a bunch of other people and they do it this way too. Oh, that's such a relief. Oh, that's interesting. Maybe we'll change how we do it, right? And it's an important aspect because what we do, if you consider, again, all the skill sets and all the questions and things we have to do as architects and landscape architects, it's a lot of stuff. And it's just more efficient and more fun to talk with people about it and get answers. Even if you don't necessarily agree with the answers, it's still helpful.
The other thing that student mentioned is that sometimes it feels more like a factory line rather than a space of creativity and exploration.
That is such a good, a good point.
I have to say, like software classes, that's kind of what they are.
Well, I don't know if he's referring to software classes or if they're referring to, like the
studio
work itself. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting, but I think it also depends on how you take it. I think you can take it as a student. You can approach it either way. Mm-hmm. You can approach it as a factory line if you're trying to just like crank through the stuff and like, let's say like you are obsessed with this, like mastering the software for your project and that's all it matters. And like the actual result and creativity is a 2%, of importance to you.
Yeah.
And you could also go the complete opposite way, where you can like ditch the software and just go full exploration on the creative side and focus on that. Depending on your school, maybe there is more favoritism toward one way of approaching it or the other, which is a different topic. But I think you should feel free to approach it, whichever way you think is right.
I think that this person is actually quite cognizant and mature about this problem of essentially the way I see it is balancing effort, call it creative effort and creative space, and giving enough to that versus production, like doing the drawings, doing the renderings, doing the models, printing the stuff, production, right? And of course, the two overlap, and they have to overlap, but they are fundamentally in the education, they are very different headspaces. And how do you find the right balance between the two? And also find the right balance. And I say balance because in the academic space and the professional space too, you have to do both equally well. There's no one that says, oh, you can do that one and not worry about that one. All teachers will be like, you have to produce everything and you have to have a great idea.
Yeah.
Do both. And for students, especially from years 1 to 5, it's really hard because you don't, that balance is always going to be shifted one way or the other, depending on the project, right? It's going to depend on the student. It's going to depend on the teacher. It's going to depend on the list of deliverables for that studio. It's going to depend on a lot of different factors. And so I think that just having a conscious awareness of these two sides like I'm describing and understanding where you are in this balance for a project and for a week as a moment in time or an entire quarter or semester is the very first big step to be made. If you can be aware of this and think about it a little bit, I think it helps students tremendously. So I always feel that for students, it's not just about being like subjectively in the mode of learning. You also have to step back and think about yourself from a bird's eye view and think like, okay, how am I kind of self-critiquing and like thinking about your overall process and your education almost from an educator standpoint and think, okay, where am I struggling with? What am I struggling with and how and why? And is it more for these reasons? Is it other reasons? Is it because, as it happens with students, I had a family event, my grandmother passed away. It happens when you get to that age and I had to disappear for a month. Now I'm behind. Okay, let me kind of reframe my own expectations for what I'm going to do this quarter or whatever it is, knowing that I've lost a month of time because of this family event or for whatever other thing that's taking place, right? And I think that kind of level of awareness is important to be more efficient in learning things, and also perhaps most importantly as a way to not let yourself become depressed or what's the word they use? Depressed or kind of not happy with what you're achieving and doing. And that mental state is very important to having a positive mental state is a very important thing to have when you're learning. You can't learn if you're angry or upset or again disappointed in yourself all the time. It's not really a great place to be in. Starting from that as a way to motivate oneself, that's different. But to be in that state is something you want to avoid. So I think being again higher level understanding of these two sides and where you're at project to project, I think is the first step. Consciousness.
The other thing that this person mentioned is that sometimes I never meet the deadline because there is not enough time, or I meet the deadline, but I do something really basic that I'm not really happy about. And I think it goes back to the balancing act between production and creativity, right? Mm-hmm. And it probably goes back to, in a way, make sure that you allocate enough time to both of these aspects to take place. Mm-hmm. So as a quick tip, which I think we mentioned before, is managing your time and making sure that you're not, forgetting one aspect versus the other. You're not focusing too much on production at the beginning, and therefore there is no time to be creative because you're already bugged with how many boards you have to print, how many models you have to make, and vice versa. But I think if you kind of look at, okay, this is when the project's starting, this is when the deadline is, and the teacher might have an expectation of deliverables based on certain dates. And that's one thing that you should, probably somewhat follow. But I think being like, okay, I have 3 months to do this project. I know I'm kind of slow at making models, so I'm going to allocate like 3 weeks to make the model. And this is like when I will, maybe stop focusing on the design aspect and start the production aspect. Or, you start the outline of your deliverables, you make a list and you kind of like make sure that you're slowly working through it. But I think thinking about the timeline, the production process, being honest with what you need more time for versus what you need less time for, and kind of make sure that you manage your time throughout is important to feel like you're
sane.
You're sane, you sleep, you're so somewhat satisfied with what you're producing in the end, and you're and yeah.
Yeah. I think what you're describing is kind of like the next level of what I said. So I said, first of all, you should understand that there are these brackets of creativity and production. And you're saying one step further than that is for the project itself, thinking about how you're proportioning your time, right? And it's critical. I think like one of the biggest mistakes, I think it's critical that's critical so that you hit deadlines, right?
Yeah.
So you finish your stuff and all that kind of stuff. But it's also, for me, as a person who doesn't like deadlines, it's critical because it will give you the mental space to enter a flow state for the thing you're focusing on. So, and I do that. I think any productive person does this. I do that in my own work. Like I will set aside time and say, okay, these next 4 hours, I'm not doing anything but this. Right now, when you have an office, 4 hours, or oftentimes it's not 4 hours, it's more like 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours dedicated to one thing is really difficult to do when you're a smaller business, because every 5 minutes you're pinged with an email, and every 5 minutes you should be doing this thing, but you can't be productive if you're doing that. So you set
turn
aside
off your emails.
You set aside time and you say, this 2.5 hours, I've accepted before I start this 2.5 hours, before I hit the start button on my timer. I don't actually use a timer, but when I hit the timer button, right? Before I've gotten into that 2.5 hours, I've already made an agreement with myself that this is all I'm doing. So if in that 2.5 hours, I miss an email, or I miss this, or I miss that, or I could have been doing something else, that's off the table. That's not part of my thinking anymore. And now I can focus. And for me, at least, the reason why that's so helpful is that when I was a student, I never thought that way. So especially when you feel like you're running out of time and you feel like, I know I have to do this elevation, this plan, this model, the renderings, my concept is bad, I don't have boards yet, and then you sit down, you try and work, and you can't, because every 5 minutes you're thinking, oh shit, but I really got to get this other thing now, right? Because I need to, because I'm running out of time. And the solution is partition it, right? And just say, okay, for the next day, I'm just going to do this thing, and I'm not worried about that other thing over there. It might even be in even more fine grain, like in the design of, I'm just going to focus on this aspect of the design, whether it be a physical portion or maybe more conceptual portion, and I'm not going to worry about this other stuff. Even though I know it's going to come back and bite me in the butt, I'm not going to worry about it, right? I'm just going to focus on this. And I think the same approach can be taken, for a project overall. It's
And I think you can even go down further, where you can make, let's say, a short priority list of things. So let's say you tackle task 1, and
lists
then eventually
are a little bit beyond my.
Oh, I used to make many lists.
I'm sure.
I had like different colors, different papers, and just making lists. But you have to make sure you strike the list. You strike things on the list. Otherwise, if you're just making them, you don't follow them, it doesn't mean anything. But like you could plan your day. If you're a student, let's say, like you have, every Friday afternoon, it's a free afternoon for you to do work. Well, plan your day. How are you going to structure those 4 hours of work that you have? Like, going to be focusing on that? Are you going to do that for 2 hours and then do something else? And in the project too, like sometimes you tackle something and at some point just hit a wall, and you just like, it's kind of like torture. Like nothing's coming out. You just keep looking at this thing and you're blocking, and then you're getting angry at yourself, and it's not being productive, and the time's running out. And in that case, just have a list of like 3 items, and you looked at item 1 because it's the biggest one on your list to look at. Now you're stuck with item 1, so switch to item 2. And then eventually when you go back to item 1, you've moved away from it, you've digested it, maybe your vision is clearer. I think being able to kind of like jump from one thing to the other will make you feel like you're making progress no matter what. And it will also unstuck you if you feel stuck in one of them. Yeah.
And that's also this part of the conversation. This is why I said I think this student is actually quite mature and smart. I mean, to be honest, any student who's struggling, who then finds a podcast and reaches out to the podcast, that automatically makes you the 1% of people, right? Yeah. I'm not saying that because we're a great podcast, but I'm saying that because it's just, to go on a slight tangent, it's the difference between all of the successful people and all the people who are, let's say, not successful or just kind of grunt workers, right? The first thing is that the successful people tried. They bothered to try, and then they kept trying. And that has nothing to do with talent or skill or anything. It just has to do with motivation. And that's the beautiful thing about life, and the beautiful thing I think about design and architecture and landscape architecture. You could just try really hard consistently and you will get somewhere, because you will outlast and beat everyone else. If you think about it in a competition, it will work that way. It's, parallel also, like I was just talking to some students. I was kind of a guest speaker at a class about some things, including design competitions. It's the same thing with design competitions. Like, I'm a big advocate for them, for students in particular. And I've given that kind of speech a bunch of times. And what separates the people who win the competition versus not is not even so much that there is 1 or 3 winners and then the others who submitted lost. It's the winners, they applied and they actually did the competition when 99% of the others didn't even do the competition, right? And that is like the fundamental, that's the biggest difference. So the fact that this student, I guess these are words of encouragement, I guess. The fact they're even doing what they did already with this paragraph, and they're thinking about their work in terms of, sometimes I'm very aware that I can think creatively and do these things, but I don't meet the deadlines or the list of deliverables. Other times I meet the deliverables, but I don't feel like it's very good. You're already at that top tier, right? And it's just going to evolve. Now, to the point of them feeling like they don't have enough time to produce the work, I want to talk about that. So,
from a first-person experience,
I had the same exact feeling when I was in school. And I also want to say that I've been part of studios where I know for a fact, written in stone, objectively true, that it was not possible for... Unless you were,
but it's the same with office and clients.
Hang on, unless you're like the 1 out of 10,000 genius people.
Yeah,
it's not possible for everyone to do this work. I've been in a lot of studios as a student that way, and I know what it feels like. And I look back, I'm like, there's no fucking way we could have done all this work. Like, it's not possible. It's totally impractical, right? And I've been there.
It's because you have to hire freelancers to help you do the work.
I've also been in a part of studios where the amount of work was like a quarter of that amount of work, and yet you have people complaining that it's too much work.
Yeah.
And of course, now I'm speaking more as a teacher, and I'm like, what the fuck are you kids complaining about? Like, this is, I'm not joking. A fraction of the amount of work that we were given when I had X studio in school. And not all the studios I had were that, that amount of overload of working, but I've been there too. So I say that because I always want to put an asterisk by these kinds of conversations, because I'm against laziness. I'm against people who complain when there's not that much to do. And I don't want to give ammunition to those lazy people. That said, I'm going to assume that this person is in a studio where there is a lot of work. And so first, I get it. And when I was actually a third-year student also, coincidentally, and I might have said it on the podcast before, we had the studio, and it was a mental amount of work. It was too much. It was like we had reoccurring like weekly assignments that just kind of constantly happened through the entire quarter. Then we had like, you know, a 3-week kind of assignment and then also a quarter assignment. Or we had like all these things constantly happening all the time.
They were trying to weed out students, I think.
That's part of the game. But it got to the point where we what happened? We as a studio, we took a field trip to I think it was to San Francisco, and we were touring an office. It might have been SOM. I don't recall. And SOM's like, you know, big name office. And we got a tour by this guy who was a project architect, whatever, right? The usual kind of song and dance stuff. Oh, this is an office. This is how we work, and it's very important to work with, you know, colleagues. I don't know, whatever things they said. And at the end, there was kind of an informal time after the tour where we're just kind of standing around waiting to go to the next thing because it's a part of field trip, so there's gaps. But we're in their office still. So I go and approach the guy at SOM by myself, and I want to talk to him one-on-one. I didn't want to talk to him with other students. Actually, I didn't care if other students were around, but I didn't want to talk to him with the teacher there because I didn't like that teacher. I thought he was full of shit. I still think he's full of shit to this day. He's full of shit. Fuck him. Like an asshole. And so I go up to the SOM guy and I ask him basically the same question. And I said to him, you know, I have a question for you. Like, I'm a third year student. You know this. I'm working really hard in my studio and I'm just having a really hard time. Like, I can't complete the work. Like, it's just, I try, I'm working. I don't know what to do. Do you have any advice?
I told you, me too.
And so, you know, I'm like, how do I handle this? And I got to that point, probably to where this listener is, where I didn't know what to do. And everyone else in my class felt the same way. We were all like, you know, filling a glass of water, like over the brim. We're like full. We were just like struggling here. We're drowning. So I go to him and I ask him thinking, you know, we have time to kill. It's an SOM guy. The teacher happened to be standing there. I'm like, fuck it. I'm going to ask the question anyway. I don't care. And it's sort of me also critiquing the class. I'm like, this is too much work. Like, I can't handle it, and other people can't handle it too. The thing I remember is the teacher didn't even allow the SOM architect to really answer because they kind of like laughed at my question, kind of laughing it off, and then giving some bullshit answer to my question, which I was annoyed with because I'm like, bro, I'm not talking to you. In my view, you're part of the problem because your feedback sucks. You're giving too much work. And I think giving too much work can be productive, but this is like insane.
Yeah.
And I'm asking him, clearly. I'm not asking you. And I will never forget that teacher basically prevented me from having a conversation with this architect. Maybe that architect would have had a great answer, maybe not. Maybe the answer would have not been helpful at all, but the teacher didn't allow that conversation to happen. And boy, oh boy, if I ever get to name names, I don't, you know. So anyway, I don't know why I told that story, but I get it. Like I've been there, and so yeah, that I don't have any point to make with that except for I that still itches me to this day because it was also so disappointing as a student because it takes a lot of courage really for a student to talk to anyone else, and in this case, an outside architect, which takes a little less courage to say, like, I'm struggling. Like, and I was really like showing I'm like, look, I'm struggling. I'm not trying to weasel my way around this conversation. Like, I'm struggling here. And it takes even more courage, I would say, to do it in front of a teacher and then have the teacher kind of laugh it off. It's like, you're a dick.
Yeah,
like,
this person should not be a teacher. But, you know, you say it takes courage to kind of like come forward. And it takes courage to come forward in any situation, right? But I do feel like you should come forward as a student in school because it is a safe environment. Like, you're not gonna get fired from school, you know. Like, if you kind of get into this practice of not being shy, mentioning if something is wrong, if you're struggling, if you think something should be done a certain way, if you notice also that you're not the only one, but nobody's speaking up, and you feel like comfortable enough to speak up for others, like, I think it's important to do it because eventually when you work for someone, for an office, and a situation arises, you can't just take the back seat and wait, you know, and you have to come forward. You have to tell people something's wrong or things need to change, or you have to leave, right? And you kind of have to learn on how to take those responsibility for yourself and basically become an adult and not be scared.
Yeah. I think there's like something students should understand is that every teacher in every studio where there's a studio project, the requirements, everyone gets a printout. I don't know if they do printouts anymore. Probably not. They always try to shift us toward like iPads and PDFs, and I hated that. I'm like, I want a physical piece of paper I can give to students that they can highlight and mark on and have on their desk. If they even have desks anymore, Jesus. But there's always a printout saying like, these are the course objectives, that kind of like stuff, right? Which is really kind of a top-down thing. And from the university, the requirements and objectives and the goals, right, are always the same, which is you have to be stellar at everything. Okay. So, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be that, but let me be very realistic and transparent with you listeners. All the teachers know the chances of that happening for a student across a 20-person student class is there's going to be like maybe 2 or 3 who can do that. And the rest won't. The rest will be, even if they're all trying hard and they're smart students, will be deficient somewhere across the half a dozen things that we're expecting you to achieve. So the reason why I'm saying that is I suppose there's some level of comfort that can be taken knowing that failure is built into the curriculum.
Of course. Yeah.
It's built into it because we are demanding from you. You do all of these things and it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen, dude. It's not going to happen. In an office, it's going to happen. But in a student setting, unlikely it's going to happen unless you're that, the few students I mentioned. So that doesn't mean that you should not try. It doesn't mean that you're going to automatically get an A. Everyone gets an A now. It doesn't make it that you have less responsibility. But I think like you should realize that, and it goes back again to understanding for yourself, for your own education, for that day, for those 2 hours, for that week, for that quarter, for the entire 4 or 5 years you exist as a student. What are you trying to learn? And then knowing, okay, I know that I don't know this thing and I need to learn this thing for this project and for other stuff. I'm going to give myself the time and the space to do it. And I know, therefore, in the end of this, I might be, a little bit more deficient in this other category of the project criteria because I've spent currency on this other thing. I've spent time on this, right? And I've reduced time being spent for this, design quality or whatever it is, or the renderings or whatever it is. And in some ways, I'm kind of like okay with that because I know over the long term, this is what I really need to know. If I don't do it now, then when am I going to do it? And that's not necessarily, I think it's true. I think it's valid. I think it's productive to understand that. I'm not also saying that if you employ that thinking and you tell a teacher that they're going to be understanding of that, because some teachers, their mentality is to not be understanding. And again, it's just to like be like a hammer and just constantly say, no, be good at all 6 things, be good at all 6 things. And it's not I don't think it's a productive way of teaching. Like you got to meet the students where they are and help them on their overall academic career. Like I always like to ask students, like, show me the work you've done beforehand so I can see what you've done. You've done the same fancy renderings the last 3 years. Don't show me another one of those. Show me something different. You're good at production. Your ideas suck, right? Focus on that stuff. So, yeah.
I think you mentioned like in your previous story, like the fact that you had too much to do in studio. Mm-hmm. It was just like the amount of, let's say, deliverable and expectation was beyond what was physically, timely possible, right? And I think it's, like I was starting to mention, like it does happen in the practice once you're out of school where, sometimes clients have unreasonable expectations or deadlines or a budget, right? Mm-hmm. And at some point, soon enough, you have to tell them that this is not realistic, and maybe the students should tell the teacher, like, this is not realistic. Like, this is not possible. Like, we've tried to do this for the last 2 months and you see everybody is struggling. So what is the goal by doing that? And maybe even understanding, like, what is the goal of doing that? Because otherwise it's just pure torture. Like, what is it? What's the end goal?
I agree. And again, a huge asterisk, I think, next to that statement. needs to be there, because it just depends on the studio. I don't know. Of late, I've seen so many students, the output is like poor, and yet they're still complaining, and I'm baffled. I'm like, what? I think that's also where, like I was saying, there's an inherent failure built into the objectives of the studio. That same thinking applies when we think about teaching a group of students versus teaching an individual. If the teacher was responsible for just teaching one student and writing a project for one student and writing a schedule for one student, like customized, right? Things would maybe feel better for that one student. But that's not the case. Like, we teach in classes of 20. And we have to have a class-wide schedule. I can't have students who are submitting materials on different deadlines. Of course not, right? But every student works at a different pace, and ideas hit them at different times too. And I think there's also some, again, inherent friction built into the way a lot of studios are taught with that. So, for example, it's a trend now these days, but when I was in school, I had a fair number of teachers where the class was very structured. So every 3 weeks we had a deadline for X part of the project. In some cases, it was like, okay, first 2 weeks, you're going to look at a detail of the project. And the next 2 weeks after that, then you look at, a room in the project. And the next 2 weeks, you look at the overall floor plan. And the next 2 weeks, it's the overall site plan. Or another studio, instead of being from small scale to big scale, which I never understood, it's like, okay, now we're going to look at facade. Then we're going to look at site plan, and then facade, and then program, and then structure, and it's all very organized. And despite my many criticisms with both of those studios, the reason why teachers attempt to have this kind of structure, one of the reasons, is that they want to keep everyone on pace. So it's like, just focus on this 2-week deadline and hit it. Then I know as a teacher, and as a student, you've produced, sort of like what I said before, like you're focusing, you're partitioning. Now you've done a facade. Now you can move to this thing. But the problem when you try and micromanage design in that manner, it's obviously what I just described is ridiculous. It makes no sense. Like, because every designer, architect works differently, especially students, and also those studios. It's like, why are we starting with a detail when we're designing a museum? What is that about, right? Why are we starting with facades when we're designing, whatever it was? And so, but anyway, so there is some inherent friction because the teachers are having to successfully, sometimes and unsuccessfully, place overall constraints on the studio, which don't align with where the students are at from 1 week to the next. Again, I don't have a solution to that, but I think just being aware of that's just part of the situation, I think helps put.
But I think you could, I have never taught a studio, so what do I know? But I feel like you could, those are elements, like the program, the plan, the facade, the room, the detail, and all of that. Those are things that students should be looking at some point in their project, right? In order for it to design, to ask themselves the right question, to get toward a result of some sort, right? Being so prescriptive, I agree, doesn't make sense. It's not one size fit all. Everybody's process and brain and creativity comes and gets triggered at different times in different ways. But you could structure a studio where every week maybe the teacher talks about one of those things, just so the students have an understanding on how to approach them when it's time for them to approach them. Mm-hmm. But they still find whatever process makes sense for them to get to that point. Mm-hmm.
It's a trend, right? Trend meaning not just 1 or 2 year trends, but probably decades. Back in the day, the way studios happened was, especially upper division studios. So years 1 and 2, things are structured because it's more like babysitting, and you're learning basic skill sets. But once you get to year 3, 4, and 5, you're supposedly much more hands off and have more freedom, and then you have full on projects that take a full quarter or semester. The way studios used to be structured was here's the site. Here's the type of building we're doing. Here's a basic list of program, maybe. Go. Yeah. Figure it out. Do what you're supposed to do. And if you're lost, then I'll help you one-on-one, but go. And now it's become this, this one teacher I know, he describes it as a Japanese game show approach, where you have to go through all these many kind of obstacles to get to the end, and then like a Japanese game show. And it's become more that way. again, I have many issues with that for many reasons. But that's one of the problems, is that it doesn't work for everybody, right? And it becomes very frustrating for people who are more independent, and or feel like they're struggling from one week when it's not aligning with the overall schedule. But to their topic, which is more about skill sets in learning softwares and experimenting in softwares, which they described, like that's kind of how you learn. You have to experiment and try stuff. So that's also when you have a computer class that you take and you're learning a software, and you learn by rote, you learn by step, because again, that's how a class that's taught to 20 or 30 students is taught. Is, okay, everyone, open up the file, go to this folder, double click. Okay, now the file's open. Does everyone see the same thing? No. Okay. And then that's how it goes, right?
Yeah.
Okay, now click on that icon. Everyone find it? No, I don't have the icon. Okay. And that's one way of learning. And it kind of has to be that way because, again, you're teaching a group of like 30 students or 20 students. But the real learning, or the other half of the learning, happens when you're more or less on your own and you're trying to do something different. And now you have to use those tools to orchestrate them in a different way to produce a result or find the new result. So experimenting should be embraced because it's part of how you learn software, and it's not fun. Asking for help is part of the solution. But the other thing too, I would say with softwares and hard skills, whether it be softwares or hand drafting or I don't know, whatever else, right, is third and fourth year, by the time you get to your last year, they should be, pretty well developed, hopefully. But it kind of doesn't really matter so much. In the end, it doesn't matter. So what I'm saying is that it's normal for a person to be deficient in some of those things in years 1, 2, and 3. And hopefully by the end of year three, you're kind of figuring things out. I think the concern students have from years 1 to 3 is like, I'm not as good as that other student in this thing. It doesn't feel good now for this project, in the studio. And also you start to worry about, what does that mean for me in the future? Like, how can I do what they're doing if I'm not there yet? And the reason why I say it doesn't matter in the end is that when you get to the end of year 5, for the most part, everyone has close to the same skill sets, or they have enough skills to communicate what they need to communicate in their designs. And it doesn't make you a good designer or a good student or a successful project. Like what I'm saying applies maybe more so to maybe years 1 and 2, where first and second year students are concerned, oh, wow, that person knows how to draw stuff. They know how to sketch. They know how to paint. They know how to do floor, whatever. I'm like, yeah, so what? By the time you get to year 5, it's not going to matter. Everyone will learn what they're going to learn. And again, by the time you go through 5 years, it has more to do with were you consistent in making an effort in building your skill set and trying and caring. If you are, then you're going to come out on top over the course of 5 years for your education, or 6 years if it's a 4+2, over the course of your career. So there is some kind of comfort again about that, right? Like don't worry too much if right now, as a years 1 to 2 and also 3, that you're not as good as someone else. It's like if you apply yourself, you'll learn it, and then you'll be fine. And honestly, like I'm not the greatest person at doing watercolors or doing hand sketches or rendering or like whatever else. It doesn't matter though, right? That doesn't make someone a good landscape architect or a bad landscape architect at all.
Yeah, and if it really like bugs you, like, well, one holiday weekend, just like go on Rhino for 5 hours and play around. Mm-hmm. Like there is also like, if you feel like you need to catch up or you need more time, like you find pockets of times that are just free of deliverables and not tied to classes, and just explore in those periods of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is hard. I mean, when you're a student, like you're busy, your schedule is busy, you need to sleep, you need to rest. But if there is a holiday or something, or spring break or summer break or whatever, just have fun. Like explore things in a way that is not tied to, a demand that someone made for you to do.
I think also, like I think a lot of this conversation has been essentially saying, choose and focus your efforts, intelligently. And I think that also applies to let's get more specific. So let's say there's the final due deliverables includes, 2 24 by 36 boards. And on there's, again, half a dozen or a dozen different things you're supposed to put on those boards plus a physical model. It's like pretty standard kind of stuff, right? Again, be very aware of spreading yourself too thin. And I think that's the worst thing you can do in terms of production. So if you're supposed to have, let's say, 3 perspective renderings, either computer renderings or hand render, whatever, 3 renderings, right? And you're like, and you think to yourself, how the heck am I going to do 3 renderings? Because they want a first person rendering from the entry, one inside of the project, and then an arrow one. And you're like, how am I going to do this? To be honest, and this actually goes for all presentations to clients and competitions. When you have very real deadlines, you pick and you choose and you focus your efforts with the time you have, because there's never enough time. So in that case, I could see one example, and I've done it before, and I've advised students before, even my own students, choose the one that's going to be the most important of those 3. And it depends on the project. And I'll tell them, make this one like 95% good, like almost as best as possible. The other 2, I want you to have it, but those can be more like outline sketches, right? And what you're doing in that case is you imagine the 3 renderings, right? You have one rendering that conveys, again, 95% accuracy of what you're trying to convey. And you spent 95% of your rendering time on that one image. And the other 2 are just like outlines. But guess what? As an audience, as a jury, as a critic, as a client, when I see that killer rendering, I'm like, okay, I get it. This one it makes the most sense for you to render because it conveys your project, but I also see what you're doing here. I can take that visual and apply it to the other 2 renderings. Especially in a professional setting, that's difficult to do. But in an academic learning setting, I think it's totally acceptable, because then you're going to get really good feedback. And also it's proven, like, well, you can actually do it and you can communicate stuff. And the idea is good. All these other things, you just ran out of time. And as a teacher and as a critic on presentations, I'm like, fine. Like, now quarter's done. Spend the break you were referring to. Do the other 2, right? Round it out. The worst thing you can do, though, is pin up all of the deliverables and have them be at like 15% completion, because now you're not conveying anything. Again, even when you step further back, the whole point of a presentation and a project is to convey the essence of the project and basically the idea. Convey that and how you're doing it, whatever manner you need. And you can pick and choose in the deliverables to focus on them and say, I'm going to put a bunch of time into this one and less than others, so I make that point really, really clear. And it's more than acceptable to do that. And actually, to be honest, a lot of the studios I taught, that's one of the biggest mistakes students made was they were trying to do everything. And I would tell them, I always had, like, as a teacher, kind of 2 roles. One is a teacher who's saying, like, again, we all have to do everything perfect, and this is our schedule. And then there's another side to the teacher saying, like, you don't have to do everything. Like, focus your time on this. And usually I wouldn't have that dialogue with a student until we were crunch time. I don't start with that at the beginning of the quarter. But it's an important lesson. I really think it's an important lesson, because you can't learn and build off of the things you've done unless you have a concrete thing. And it's better to have one concrete thing. I have two looser ones rather than have 3 that are crap.
I mean, you should do everything. It's just not everything has to be done to the same level of execution. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing in practice. Like, you should have all of your drawings in your construction set, but they're not all going to be drawn at, an inch scale with all of the details, right? Like, you're going to have some that are, much, much simpler in what they're showing, and some that are going to get into the nitty gritty and very small dimensions, because you need to get down to that level of precision.
You mean in terms of diversity of deliverables? Not execution level. CDs are fully done. What do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, like your example of rendering, like one is more of a sketch, the other one is like a full-blown, hyper realistic rendering. It's the same, like, when you do the construction drawings, not every drawing is detailed to the same level. So if you compare a wall section that's extremely detailed to the hyper realistic rendering, you're going to have drawings in your CD set that are more like a sketch, like a building elevation that just shows like how many windows and what kind of materials you have. And then you have other types of drawings that show different types of information. And
that's interesting. The way I would kind of understand, I think I can see the tie. In my view, though, one example is about three call them drawings, drawings that are the same, but you are choosing for the sake of time and the sake of education to make one really good and then still do the other two, but just put less time into it. I think what you're describing, though, is the value of understanding that different deliverables and drawings convey different things and understanding what they bring to the table. So that's how I would understand it. Like not all, and that maybe to me gets more to the point of
But I think it's the same with the renderings, right? I mean, you can have 3 different views of the project, but really, like, there is probably only one that shows what the project is about. I don't think you need like the 3 of them to be equally done in the same way.
I think it's also easy. It's easy for students to not understand in the overall presentation across the different deliverables which ones are more important for them for that project and for their own education. Layered on top of that criteria on top of this as well. And again, spreading yourself too thin to producing things that are redundant. Like you don't need to have a 3 images and drawings, even if they're of different types, that say the same exact thing. That's not helpful in a design presentation. And the reason why now we're talking about presentations and understanding what's valuable in them is that buys you time, right? If you can be efficient and understand clearly what is in the presentation and do only that, now you've bought yourself probably a few extra days or weeks of time instead of spreading yourself too thin again. And there is a parallel between that and the CDs, and that in construction documents, everything in the construction every drawing in the CDs conveys something different. And actually, as a principle, you don't want to have redundant information in a construction document set for the sake of work efficiency, yes, but also because it creates confusion. So that's just a general rule when you're doing CDs, is you don't double up information, because it creates confusion, and also because if you say something here, you say the same thing again on another sheet, but you say there's a typo, now again you have problems.
Yeah, and I think that's where the list of deliverables sometimes like throws off students, because they don't know the hierarchy of those deliverables.
Hierarchy, yeah.
Or what it means to their project, like let's say a basic site plan, like a really, really big scale that shows the building and like a teeny tiny thing. You don't need to spend like a week drawing that and having all the buildings around perfectly accurate. At this point, it doesn't really matter, right? Like you should focus your time.
Project.
Okay, big asterisks, everything we said depends on the project, fine. But you know what I mean? Like you probably should spend more time drawing your actual floor plan of your building,
right, rather
than like this teeny tiny diagram that shows where your building is on a Google map, thing that you've drawn. Like it's a waste of time. And I think teachers should also express that and tell students those values. Like, don't waste 3 days, getting a DWG of the exact, Google Map zoning of your thing. Or if you do, then one person in the studio does it, shares it with everyone, and everybody just saves a day of work, right?
Yeah.
Like, let's just be more efficient. I think efficiency in student lifetime is something that's really hard to achieve, because the nature of creative process, which is inefficient by itself. But I think there is pockets of efficiency that could be found, and it's either encouraged by the teacher or the students have to find those pockets of efficiency.
Working backwards from the presentation, once the project has some legs into it, so let's say you're halfway through the quarter or semester, or maybe 60% of the way through. So now everyone understands like kind of what they're doing. Okay, this person's doing that kind of scheme. I'm doing this kind of scheme. Like we all have kind of our lanes, and no one's like completely confused anymore. That's working backward from the presentation is so productive for all the things you're talking about. And it's just, it really ties into the fundamentals also of what we do as landscape architects and designers is we exist to convey ideas, whether those ideas be in design presentations, technical documents, meetings with clients, in theoretical writings. We convey ideas, and one of the most important lessons you have to learn as a student is how to convey an idea clearly. And so, like you said, once you get the list of deliverables from the teacher, that generic list that's on the 8.5 by 11 printout at the beginning of the quarter, you have to critique and analyze it and decide for yourself. In that list, everything looks equally weighted, right? You have that list, site plan, floor plan, second floor plan, 2 elevations, 1 section. Everything looks like the same, right? And the way it's written in that Times New Roman font looks like everything is equally important. You just kind of do everything. No, absolutely not. You do everything, yes, but you choose based on your project. You say, you know what? The 2 elevations are one of the 2 of the most important parts in my project. So I'm going to spend a lot of times on those. And the floor plan in my case is maybe less important. Now, the other layer on top of that, like I said before, are learning objectives, right? So you have to know as yourself, hey, I'm making stuff up. I've done 3 projects so far in my career as a student, and all my projects for some reason have been focused on elevations. Then you have to be honest with yourself and say, well, maybe I have to focus not on that again to learn. And there's also learning objectives that the teachers will see in you or as part of the studio and say, the studio, we're meant to be learning this thing, so you have to be focusing on this thing. And that's tricky, right? Between all those 3 different criteria being kind of overlapped on each other. But if you can overlap it correctly and find the deliverable that makes sense, it's really, really cool because you have like complete freedom to just focus on that one thing. And by the way, this is an important skill set to develop because when you are doing, let's say, a competition or you're working on your own, you don't have the structure of everyone else around you. This is the same thing you have to do anyway. You can't be wasting time producing a bunch of different deliverables when half of those things aren't really relevant to the conversation or the presentation to the client. Shoot, no. You could show up to a client meeting and show only one type of deliverable because it's the most important for that project or for that particular meeting or for whatever it is, right? So I think thinking critically, the critical thinking aspect of the deliverables is in some ways, when you get to the 60% mark for a project, the starting point for proportioning the time and then also, knowing what you're going to learn by doing those things.
Yeah, and I think as soon as you get that list of deliverable, like come up with a strategic plan on how you're going to tackle it, like we just mentioned.
Yeah.
Because let's say the easy stuff that you're going to need, kind of like the boilerplate information, type of drawings, like either you could kick them out and do them right away, so that's off the table, you don't have to worry about them, or like keep them for the very end, so you first focus on the biggest item on your list.
Yeah. All right. Well, somehow we ended up talking about presentations, but I think it is a key part for sure. Anything else?
Nope.
Give us an outro.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode. If you like what we do, please follow us everywhere you can on all the podcast platform. We're on Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, and many other podcast platforms. We have the website, secondstudiopod.com, where you can find all of the episodes. We are also on social media, mostly Instagram, Second Studio Pod. We have the hotline. You can send a text message or call and leave a voicemail. The number is 213-222-6950. And what else? We have a lot more coming up. If you have any questions like this, any guests.
Follow us on social media and contribute to the conversations that take place. Right?
Sure.
And I think that's, I think that's everything. Okay, cool. Well, we didn't get to the other question, but that just gives us content for the next conversation. But we're always looking for things to talk about. So if you have a question, then do reach out and talk soon. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.